The valet at Oceana's stepped forward to take my modest 2015 Honda Civic as I pulled up to Miami's most exclusive waterfront restaurant, the same establishment where my family was currently enjoying what they believed was a once-in-a-lifetime dinner that Kevin could barely afford on his accountant's salary. What they didn't know was that I, Shirley Williams, the embarrassing old woman, that my daughter-in-law Sophia had specifically disinvited from tonight's celebration, owned not just this restaurant, but the entire chain of 7 upscale establishments that had made me one of Miami's most successful restaurateurs over the past 30 years. Carlos Ramirez, my head waiter and general manager, spotted me the moment I stepped through the mahogany doors into the elegant dining room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. His face lit up with genuine warmth as he immediately abandoned the wine service he was performing for a table of tourists and walked directly toward me with the kind of respect and attention that only comes from years of working relationship built on mutual trust and success. "Madam Owner," Carlos called out in his distinctive voice that carried across the restaurant's main dining room, his words cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft jazz that provided the sophisticated atmosphere Oceana's was famous for. "What a wonderful surprise! We weren't expecting you tonight. Shall I prepare your usual table overlooking the water?" The silence that followed Carlos's enthusiastic greeting was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 72 years of life. Every conversation in our section of the restaurant stopped mid-sentence as diners turned to see who merited such deferential treatment from the staff of Miami's most prestigious dining establishment. But the silence that mattered most came from table 12, where my son Kevin sat frozen with his fork halfway to his mouth, while Sophia's wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered against her dinner plate, sending Chianti splashing across the white tablecloth like drops of blood at a crime scene. Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter, was the first to recover from the shock, her young mind processing what she was witnessing faster than the adults who had spent months making assumptions about my financial situation and social status. "Grandma Shirley?" she said, her voice carrying across the dining room with a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "Did he just call you the owner? Do you own this restaurant?" Kevin's expression shifted through several stages of disbelief as he tried to reconcile the modest grandmother he thought he knew with the reality of a woman who apparently owned the kind of establishment that charged more for a single meal than most people spent on groceries in a month. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly while he stared at me standing in the entrance of a restaurant he'd described to his colleagues as probably beyond our budget. "But Sophia insists we need to make an impression." But it was Sophia's reaction that provided the most dramatic contrast to the scene that had unfolded just 3 hours earlier in Kevin's living room, where she had systematically explained to the family why my presence at tonight's dinner would be inappropriate and embarrassing. The woman who had described me as that old woman who shops at thrift stores and clips coupons was now watching me being treated like royalty by the staff of the most exclusive restaurant in Miami, her carefully constructed narrative about family social status crumbling in real time. "There must be some mistake," Sophia whispered, though her voice carried far enough for nearby tables to hear her obvious distress. "She can't be the owner. She lives in that tiny house in Little Havana and drives a 15-year-old car. She wears clothes from Walmart and brings covered dishes to family gatherings instead of hiring caterers." Carlos, who had been managing Oceana's for 8 years and knew my story better than most people, looked genuinely confused by Sophia's comments. "Madam Williams has owned this restaurant and 6 others for over 2 decades, he said with a kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed his surprise at hearing someone question my credentials. "She built this entire chain from a single food truck that she started after moving to Miami from Puerto Rico. Would you like me to show you to your private dining room, or would you prefer to join your family at their table?" The moment when your entire understanding of reality shifts is unlike anything else in human experience. And I could see that realization washing over my family as they processed the impossible truth that the woman they'd been patronizing and excluding was actually more successful than they had ever imagined. Building a restaurant empire in Miami had never been part of my original plan when I arrived from Puerto Rico 43 years ago with a suitcase full of family recipes and enough money to rent a small apartment in what was then a struggling neighborhood called Little Havana. I'd come to the mainland with my young son Kevin after my husband died in a construction accident, determined to create a better life for us both through the only skills I possessed: an intuitive understanding of food, an unshakable work ethic, and the kind of determination that comes from having no backup plan. The early years had been a study in survival rather than success. I'd worked 3 jobs: cleaning offices at night, preparing food for a catering company during the day, and selling homemade pastelis and alcapurrias from a small cart outside construction sites on weekends. Kevin had grown up understanding that Mom worked constantly, that every dollar was precious, and that success meant having enough money to pay rent and buy groceries without choosing between them. The transformation from food cart to restaurant empire had taken 30 years of careful planning, strategic reinvestment, and the kind of calculated risk-taking that most people associate with Wall Street rather than the food service industry. I'd opened my first restaurant, Abuela's Kitchen, in 1995 with a loan secured against everything I owned, serving authentic Puerto Rican cuisine to homesick immigrants and adventurous locals who appreciated flavors that couldn't be found in mainstream Miami establishments. But what had made the real difference was my decision to gradually expand into upscale dining while maintaining my roots in the community that had supported my early success. As Miami's restaurant scene evolved and attracted international attention, I developed concepts that bridged the gap between authentic cultural cuisine and the sophisticated dining experiences that tourists and business professionals expected from a world-class city. Oceana's had been my crowning achievement, a waterfront restaurant that combined my understanding of hospitality with the kind of elegant atmosphere that attracted celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who wanted to impress clients or celebrate important occasions. The success of Oceana's had allowed me to open 6 additional restaurants across Miami-Dade County, each with its own identity, but all built on the foundation of exceptional food, impeccable service, and the kind of attention to detail that separates good restaurants from legendary ones. What Kevin didn't understand, what I had never told him during his childhood or adult years, was that his modest lifestyle had been a choice rather than a necessity for decades. The small house in Little Havana, where I still lived, was the same one I'd bought when he was 10 years old, kept not because I couldn't afford something larger, but because it represented my roots and reminded me of the journey that had brought us to success. The decision to maintain my modest lifestyle while building wealth had been deliberate, partly because I wanted to stay connected to the community that had supported me, and partly because I'd watched too many successful people lose their way when money became more important than the values that had made them successful in the first place. Kevin had grown up with stability and opportunities, but he'd never known that his college education, his first car, and the down payment on his house had all been funded by restaurants that were generating millions in annual revenue. The irony of Kevin's current financial struggles was that they were largely self-imposed, the result of lifestyle choices and career decisions that prioritized comfort over ambition. His accounting job provided steady income but limited growth potential, while Sophia's real estate career had been moderately successful during good market years but struggled during economic downturns that affected luxury property sales. But it was Sophia's attitude toward my perceived poverty that had created the tension that would eventually lead to tonight's dramatic revelation. From the moment Kevin had married her 5 years ago, Sophia had made it clear that she considered my modest lifestyle embarrassing and my presence at upscale social events inappropriate. She'd gradually excluded me from family celebrations that might involve her professional contacts, suggesting that my limited means and outdated style reflected poorly on Kevin's success and her own social aspirations. The woman who shopped at designer boutiques and drove a leased BMW had spent years looking down on the woman who shopped at thrift stores and drove a reliable used car, never suspecting that the poor old woman she was patronizing could buy and sell her lifestyle multiple times over without affecting her daily routine. The confrontation that led to tonight's dramatic revelation had unfolded in Kevin's living room 3 hours earlier, when the family had gathered to finalize plans for celebrating his promotion to senior accountant at Morrison and Associates. What should have been a happy family moment had instead become an exercise in social engineering, as Sophia systematically explained why my presence at the celebration dinner would be inappropriate and potentially embarrassing for everyone involved. "Kevin, we need to talk about the guest list for tonight," Sophia had announced, settling into her designer chair with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for days. "I've made reservations at Oceana's for 4 people, and I really think it should be just us and Emma. This is an important professional milestone, and the restaurant is going to be full of influential people who could impact your career trajectory." Emma, who had been looking forward to her first dinner at Miami's most prestigious restaurant, immediately understood the implications of reducing the party from 5 people to 4. "What about Grandma Shirley?" she asked, her 16-year-old sense of fairness automatically challenging the exclusion. "This is Dad's celebration, and she's family. Why wouldn't she come with us?" Sophia's response had been delivered with the kind of gentle condescension that made her prejudices sound like practical considerations rather than personal judgments. "Sweetheart, Oceana's is a very upscale establishment with a specific atmosphere and clientele. The average dinner costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week, and your grandmother, well, she's just not comfortable in that kind of environment." Kevin had shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly torn between loyalty to his mother and his desire to avoid conflict with his wife, but his silence felt like complicity as Sophia continued building her case for my exclusion. "Don't get me wrong, I have tremendous respect for your grandmother's work ethic and her dedication to family," Sophia continued, "but she's never been exposed to fine dining or sophisticated social situations. She shops at thrift stores, clips coupons, and brings covered dishes to family gatherings instead of hiring caterers." The catalog of my supposed shortcomings had continued with increasing specificity. My outdated wardrobe that would look out of place among Oceana's fashionable clientele, my unfamiliarity with proper dining etiquette that might embarrass Kevin in front of his colleagues, and my general lack of sophistication that could reflect poorly on the family's social status. Each criticism had been delivered with false sympathy, as if Sophia was protecting me from an uncomfortable situation rather than protecting herself from association with someone she considered beneath her standards. "I'm just saying that tonight is about celebrating Kevin's success and making connections that could benefit his career," Sophia had explained to Emma, who was looking increasingly upset by the direction of the conversation. "Your grandmother is a wonderful woman, but she comes from a different generation and a different social background. She wouldn't enjoy herself, and honestly, her presence might create awkward situations that could distract from the purpose of the evening." Emma's response had been immediate and passionate. "That's horrible, Mom. Grandma Shirley raised Dad by herself and worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities. She deserves to celebrate his success more than anyone, and you're talking about her like she's some kind of embarrassment." But Kevin's failure to defend me had been the most disappointing aspect of the entire conversation. Instead of challenging Sophia's characterization of his mother or insisting on my inclusion in his celebration, he'd chosen the path of least resistance that had defined most of his adult relationships. "Maybe Mom would be more comfortable if we celebrated with her separately," he'd suggested weakly. "We could take her to that little Cuban place she likes, somewhere more her speed." The phrase "more her speed" had stung more than any of Sophia's direct insults, suggesting that my son had internalized his wife's assessment of my social limitations and financial constraints. The man I'd raised to value character over appearances, who had benefited from my sacrifices and determination throughout his childhood, was now agreeing that his mother wasn't sophisticated enough to attend his celebration dinner. Sophia's final argument had been delivered with the triumphant tone of someone who believed she was winning a difficult but necessary battle. "Look, I've already made the reservation for 4 people at 7 p.m. Oceana's is booked months in advance, and changing the party size at this point would be impossible. Kevin, you know I'm right about this. Tonight is about your future, and we need to present ourselves appropriately. Sitting alone in my modest little Havana house after being excluded from my own son's celebration dinner, I faced a choice that would fundamentally alter my family's understanding of who I was and what I had achieved over the past 3 decades in Miami. The living room where I'd raised Kevin, surrounded by furniture that was comfortable rather than fashionable, and family photos that documented our journey from struggling immigrants to stable Americans, felt like a shrine to the life I'd chosen to maintain despite having the resources to live very differently. The irony of Sophia's assessment of my financial limitations wasn't lost on me as I sat in a house that I owned outright while she and Kevin struggled with mortgage payments on a property that consumed 40% of their combined income. The woman who had just explained that I couldn't afford fine dining and would be uncomfortable in sophisticated social situations had no idea that I could purchase the restaurant where they were celebrating and still have enough money left over to buy their house as a weekend property. But the real turning point wasn't about money or social status, it was about respect and family loyalty. Kevin's willingness to exclude his mother from his celebration because his wife found my presence embarrassing had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed without consequences. The son who had benefited from my sacrifices throughout his childhood and early adulthood was now agreeing that I wasn't appropriate company for his professional success. I called Carlos at Oceana's, knowing that he would be overseeing the evening service and could provide me with information about my family's dinner plans without violating customer privacy policies that didn't apply to the restaurant's owner. "Carlos, I have a favor to ask," I said, settling into my kitchen chair with a cup of Café Cubano and the kind of determination that had built my restaurant empire from nothing. "My family is dining at Oceana's tonight, and I'd like to surprise them. Can you tell me about their reservation?" Carlos's voice carried immediate concern as he processed my request, understanding that family dynamics were often more complicated than business relationships, but wanting to support whatever decision I was making. "Of course, Madam Williams. They have a table for 4 at 7 o'clock, your son Kevin, his wife, and their daughter. Should I prepare your usual private dining room, or would you prefer to join them at their regular table?" The decision to reveal my ownership of Oceana's to my family hadn't been made in anger, though anger was certainly present. It was made with the clear understanding that some relationships require dramatic interventions to address fundamental imbalances, and that Kevin needed to learn what happened when you allow prejudice and social climbing to override family loyalty and basic respect. "I think I'll make a dramatic entrance tonight," I told Carlos, already planning the timing that would maximize the impact of my revelation. "Can you arrange for me to arrive around 8:30, after they've ordered but before the main course? I want them to be settled and comfortable before their world gets turned upside down." Carlos's laughter carried the appreciation of someone who had watched me navigate complex business situations with strategic thinking and perfect timing. "I understand completely, Madam Williams. Should I prepare any special arrangements for your arrival, or do you want to handle this personally?" The plan that emerged during our conversation was elegantly simple. I would arrive at Oceana's as myself, wearing the same modest clothes that Sophia found embarrassing, driving the same reliable car that she considered beneath her standards. But instead of being treated as an unwelcome guest who didn't belong in sophisticated surroundings, I would be welcomed as the owner of the establishment where my family was learning that appearances could be deceiving. "Just treat me exactly as you always do," I instructed Carlos. "Don't modify your usual greeting or try to downplay my position. I want my family to understand exactly who they've been excluding and what they've been assuming about my life and capabilities." The drive to Oceana's gave me time to reflect on the 30 years of choices that had led to this moment. The decision to reinvest profits rather than upgrade my lifestyle, the choice to remain in my original neighborhood rather than move to prestigious addresses, the preference for authenticity over image that had allowed my daughter-in-law to completely misunderstand my position and prospects. Tonight, Kevin and Sophia would learn that sometimes the people you underestimate are simply choosing not to reveal their full capabilities until the moment is right for education. The moment I stepped through Oceana's mahogany entrance doors, every carefully constructed assumption that had shaped my family's treatment of me for the past 5 years began to crumble in spectacular fashion. The restaurant's main dining room buzzed with the kind of sophisticated energy that comes from Miami's most influential residents gathering to celebrate business deals, romantic milestones, and social achievements. But all of that faded into background noise as Carlos approached me with the enthusiasm and respect that only comes from years of successful business partnership. "Madam Owner," Carlos announced, his voice carrying across the dining room with genuine warmth as he abandoned his wine service to greet me personally. "What a wonderful surprise. We weren't expecting you tonight, but your family is here celebrating at table 12. Shall I escort you to their table, or would you prefer your private dining room overlooking the bay?" The transformation of my family's expressions was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Emma dropped her dinner roll and stared at me with the wide-eyed amazement that only teenagers can display when their entire understanding of reality gets rewritten in a single moment. Kevin's fork froze halfway to his mouth, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning comprehension as he tried to reconcile his modest mother with a woman who was apparently being treated like royalty by Miami's most exclusive restaurant. But Sophia's reaction was the most dramatic, a complete physical collapse of the confident social climber who had spent 3 hours explaining why I didn't belong in sophisticated environments. Her wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against her dinner plate, sending Chianti splashing across the white tablecloth while she stared at me with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview implode in real time. "There has to be some mistake," Sophia whispered, though her voice carried far enough for nearby tables to overhear her obvious distress. "She can't be the owner. She lives in a tiny house and drives an old car. She shops at thrift stores and brings covered dishes to family gatherings. This is impossible." Carlos, who had been managing Oceana's for 8 years and knew my story better than most people, looked genuinely puzzled by Sophia's comments about my supposed poverty. "Mrs. Williams has owned this restaurant and 6 others throughout Miami-Dade County for over 20 years, he explained with professional courtesy that barely concealed his surprise at hearing someone question my credentials. "She built the entire chain from a single food truck after immigrating from Puerto Rico. The Williams Restaurant Group employs over 400 people and generates approximately $15 million in annual revenue." The silence that followed Carlos's explanation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a restaurant setting. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped as diners turned to witness the unfolding drama, while my family sat frozen in what appeared to be collective shock. Emma was the first to recover, her young mind processing the revelation faster than the adults who had been operating under false assumptions for years. "Grandma Shirley, you own this place?" Emma asked, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and confusion. "You own all those restaurants? But why didn't you ever tell us? Why do you live in that small house if you're rich?" Kevin finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mom, is this true? Are you really the owner? Have you been wealthy this entire time while I've been struggling with mortgage payments and worrying about Emma's college fund?" I looked around the dining room that represented the culmination of 30 years of strategic planning and reinvestment, at the restaurant that had been generating more profit in a single month than Kevin earned in an entire year, and then back at my family who had spent the evening assuming I couldn't afford to join their celebration. "I've been successful for quite some time," I said calmly, watching Sophia's face cycle through embarrassment, confusion, and what appeared to be genuine horror as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. "But I've chosen to maintain a modest lifestyle because I prefer authenticity over ostentation. Unlike some people, I don't need expensive possessions or prestigious addresses to feel good about myself." The phrase, "unlike some people," hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone at the table understood exactly who I was referencing: as I stood surrounded by the success they had never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. 6 months after that life-changing dinner at Oceana's, I sat in my newly remodeled home office, reviewing quarterly profit reports from my 7 restaurants while reflecting on how dramatically my family relationships had evolved since the night my hidden success became impossible to ignore. The same modest house in Little Havana that Sophia had once considered embarrassing now served as the headquarters for a restaurant empire that had expanded to include 2 new locations and Epsiditing Sivan, a catering division that served Miami's most exclusive events. The immediate aftermath of my revelation had been swift and transformative for everyone involved. Kevin had spent weeks processing the reality that his mother's financial limitations had been a carefully maintained fiction, that the woman he'd been pitying for her modest lifestyle was actually more successful than anyone in his professional circle. The guilt over excluding me from his celebration dinner had evolved into a deeper understanding of how his assumptions and prejudices had damaged our relationship for years. "Mom, I feel like I don't even know who you are," Kevin had said during one of our first honest conversations after that dramatic evening. "All these years I thought you needed my help, that you were struggling financially and just too proud to ask for support. I had no idea you were supporting Emma's college fund, helping with our mortgage, and running a multi-million-dollar business while I patronized you about budgeting and practical financial decisions." Emma's adjustment to her grandmother's revealed wealth had been the most positive development of the entire situation. Instead of being impressed by money, she'd been fascinated by the story of building success from nothing, asking detailed questions about business strategy, immigrant entrepreneurship, and the decisions that had allowed me to create opportunities for hundreds of employees while maintaining my connection to the community that had supported my early struggles. "Grandma, I want to work at one of your restaurants this summer," Emma had announced during a family dinner at my house, where she now spent most weekends learning about business operations and family history that had been hidden from her for years. "Not because you're my grandmother, but because I want to understand how you built something real from nothing. That's way cooler than just inheriting money or marrying into wealth." Sophia's transformation had been the most complex and difficult to watch. The woman who had spent years dismissing me as an embarrassing burden had been forced to confront the reality that she'd been insulting and excluding someone who could purchase her lifestyle multiple times over without affecting her daily routine. The social humiliation of learning about my wealth in such a public setting had been compounded by the realization that her behavior had been witnessed by many of Miami's most influential residents who were now questioning her judgment and character. "Shirley, I owe you an apology that I'm not sure how to deliver," Sophia had said during an awkward conversation 6 weeks after the Oceana's incident. "I spent so much time focusing on appearances and social status that I completely missed who you actually were and what you'd accomplished. I was so wrong about everything, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." But the most meaningful change had been in my relationship with Kevin, who had finally begun to understand that respect and love couldn't be based on assumptions about someone's financial status or social position. Our weekly dinners had become opportunities for honest conversation about family values, the meaning of success, and the importance of judging people by their character rather than their possessions. The decision to gradually reveal more details about my business empire hadn't been about flaunting wealth, but about teaching important lessons about appearance versus reality, the value of hard work, and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on limited information. I'd started including Kevin and Emma in business decisions, showing them how success could be built through strategic thinking, community investment, and the kind of authentic relationships that couldn't be purchased or inherited. The lesson extended far beyond my own family situation. In a world where social media and consumer culture constantly encourage people to judge others based on external markers of success, my story served as a reminder that the most impressive achievements are often hidden behind modest lifestyles, chosen by people who understand that true wealth includes financial security, meaningful relationships, and the respect that comes from genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. Sometimes the most important education comes from discovering that the people you've underestimated are simply choosing not to reveal their full capabilities until the moment arrives for teaching lessons about respect, assumptions, and the real meaning of family loyalty.